Henry stopped pacing and turned to face him. "You don't need to know them, Elias. They know you. That's enough." Elias looked up, fear and frustration warring in his eyes. "So what do we do? Just wait for them to show up and kill me? Because that's what this list says, right? That I've got 3 days left." Henry's expression darkened. "We're not going to wait. First, we figure out what this clock really is and why it matters. Then we figure out how to stop them." Elias glanced at the clock on the workbench. Its steady ticking seemed louder now, like a drumbeat of inevitability. "I've already taken it apart," he said. "The discs are all I found inside. There's nothing else." Henry stepped closer to the clock, leaning over it as if scrutinizing it for the first time. "You're sure?" "I've been fixing clocks my whole life," Elias snapped. "If there was something else in there, I'd have found it." "Not if it's hidden," Henry said, his tone careful but insistent. "These people don't leave things to chance. If they wanted this clock fixed, it's because it's carrying something or doing something you haven't noticed yet." Elias frowned, his gaze flicking between Henry and the clock. "Like what?" Henry didn't answer right away. He leaned in, his fingers brushing the surface of the brass casing. The engravings glinted faintly in the lamplight, their patterns intricate and precise. "Do you have a magnifying glass?" Henry asked suddenly. Elias raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "Just get it," Henry said, his voice clipped. With a resigned sigh, Elias rummaged through a drawer and handed him a small magnifying glass. Henry held it over the clock's surface, examining the engravings in closer detail. His face tightened. "What is it?" Elias asked, stepping closer. "These markings," Henry said, pointing to a faint pattern along the edge of the clock. "They're not just decorative, they're coordinates." Elias blinked. "Coordinates? Like for a location?" Henry nodded grimly. "That's my guess. And if this clock is meant to lead someone somewhere..." He trailed off, his expression darkening further. Elias's stomach twisted. "What?" Henry met his gaze. "It means this clock isn't just some message, it's a tool. And if your name's on that disc, Elias, you're part of whatever they're planning, whether you like it or not." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The ticking of the clock filled the silence like a taunt. The air in the shop seemed heavier now, thick with unspoken fear. Elias sat slumped in a chair, staring at the clock on the workbench. Its steady ticking filled the silence, each sound sharp and deliberate. Across from him, Henry leaned against the counter, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "We need to figure this out," Henry said, breaking the silence. "If your name's on that list, they already have a plan in motion. And if the Black Meridian is involved, they don't make mistakes." Elias ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "What do you want me to do? This isn't exactly something I can call the cops about. Hey, someone left me a murder clock. Can you check it out?" He let out a bitter laugh, his voice cracking under the strain. Henry opened his mouth to respond, but a faint noise from outside stopped him cold. It was soft at first, just the faint creak of snow crunching underfoot, but it was enough to draw their attention. Both men turned toward the front of the shop, their eyes narrowing as they stared at the frost-covered windows. "You heard that, right?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry held up a hand, silencing him. The shop was deathly quiet now, save for the relentless ticking of the clocks. Then it came again, a faint scrape like someone shifting their weight against the outside wall. Henry moved to the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small revolver, the worn grip fitting easily into his hand. Elias stared at him, his eyes widening. "Since when do you carry a gun?" "Since I started running a shop next to people who get mixed up with killers," Henry muttered, his voice dry. Elias shot him a glare but said nothing. His heart was pounding in his chest as he watched Henry unlock the door with careful precision. Henry cracked the door open just an inch, the cold night air rushing in. He leaned out slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the snow-covered street. The soft glow of the street lamp cast long shadows across the ground, but the street itself was empty. Henry pulled the door open wider, stepping outside onto the icy pavement. He glanced left and right, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Do you see anything?" Elias hissed from inside. Henry held up a hand again, motioning for him to stay quiet. He took a few steps forward, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. The shop's exterior was dark, the faint glow from inside barely reaching the edges of the alley beside it. Then Henry stopped. His gaze locked onto a set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the shop and disappearing into the alley. "Someone was here," he muttered under his breath. "What?" Elias called softly, stepping to the doorway. Henry turned, motioning for him to stay inside. "There's a trail. They were right outside the window." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. He gripped the edge of the door frame tightly, his knuckles white. Who the hell would be out here at this hour? Henry didn't answer. He followed the footprints a few more steps, peering into the shadows of the alley. But whoever had been there was gone now, vanished into the night. After a moment, he turned back and walked toward the shop, his expression grim. He slipped inside quickly, locking the door behind him. "Whoever it was, they were watching us," Henry said, sliding the revolver back into his coat. "They didn't stick around, but I don't like this. Not one bit." Elias let out a shaky breath, his mind racing. "Do you think it was them? The Black Meridian?" Henry frowned. "Could be, or it could be someone working for them. Either way, they know we're onto something. That clock isn't just dangerous, Elias, it's bait." Elias stared at the clock on the workbench. It's ticking louder now, almost mocking. "So what do we do? If they're watching the shop, they'll know if we try to leave." Henry paced the room, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. "We lay low, for now. Keep the lights off and don't make a sound. Tomorrow you start looking for answers. That woman who brought you the clock, if anyone knows what's going on, it's her." Elias nodded reluctantly, though the thought of confronting the mysterious woman made his stomach turn. "And Elias," Henry added, his tone serious, "don't tell anyone else about this, not a soul. If the Black Meridian thinks you're talking, they'll move faster than we can react." Elias swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. "I didn't ask for any of this," he muttered bitterly. "I know," Henry said, his voice softening. "But right now, you're in their sights. The only thing we can do is stay one step ahead." The shop fell silent again, the ticking of the clocks filling the air like a taunt. Elias glanced at the darkened windows, his chest tightening with unease. Whoever had been outside was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He sat back down in the chair, his head in his hands, as Henry began checking the locks on the windows. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a single thought repeated itself like a mantra. 3 days. 3 days to figure this out, or die. Elias paced the length of the back room, his movements restless and agitated. The steady ticking of the clock grated on his nerves, each sound a reminder of the time he didn't have. Across the room, Henry stood near the window, the revolver resting in his hand as he peeked through the curtains at the darkened street outside. "Anything?" Elias asked, his voice tight. "Nothing," Henry muttered, letting the curtain fall back into place. He turned to face Elias, his expression grim. "Whoever was out there, they're long gone now. But don't think for a second that means we're safe." Elias ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come back. If they want me dead, they'll find a way. We have to do something." Henry frowned, his grip tightening on the revolver. "Do what exactly? March out there and start asking questions? That's a quick way to get yourself killed." "I'm not just going to sit here," Elias snapped. "That woman, the one who brought me the clock, she knows something. She has to. If we can find her." Henry cut him off, his voice sharp. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Elias. If she's tied to the Black Meridian, then she's not someone you can trust. She brought this to you for a reason, and it wasn't out of the kindness of her heart." Elias stopped pacing, turning to face Henry. "What choice do I have? My name's on that list, Henry. If I don't figure out why, I'm dead in 3 days." Henry sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I get it, I do. But if you go chasing after her without a plan, you're just going to make things worse." Elias crossed his arms, his jaw set. "Then help me make a plan." Henry stared at him for a long moment, the tension thick in the air. Finally he nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "Fine. But we do this carefully. First we figure out who she is. Did she leave anything behind? Something we can use to track her?" Elias frowned, his mind racing. He thought back to the woman's visit, replaying every detail. The satchel, the clock, her urgent tone. And then he remembered. She paid me in cash, he said suddenly. Henry raised an eyebrow. Okay, and? The envelope, Elias continued. She had an envelope of money in her coat. I saw her pull it out. Maybe it's still in the trash. Henry's brow furrowed. It's not much, but it's a start. Let's check. Elias moved quickly to the trash bin near the workbench, his heart pounding. He rummaged through the crumpled receipts and scraps of paper, his hands trembling. Then, at the bottom of the bin, he found it, a plain white envelope, slightly crumpled but intact. He held it up triumphantly. Got it. Henry stepped closer, taking the envelope from Elias. He examined it carefully, flipping it over in his hands. No name, no return address, he muttered. Figures, but... He tilted it under the light, his eyes narrowing. There's a watermark here. Looks like it's from a hotel. Elias leaned in, squinting at the faint symbol embossed on the corner of the envelope. It was a stylized logo, a pair of interlocking keys surrounded by laurel leaves. Beneath it were the words Whitlock Arms Hotel. That's local, Elias said, his pulse quickening. It's on the edge of town. She could still be there. Henry shook his head. Or she could have already skipped town. Either way, if she's staying there, she'll be keeping a low profile. Don't expect her to just hand you answers. Elias's jaw tightened. I have to try. Henry placed a firm hand on his shoulder, stopping him. If you go, you're not going alone. I'll come with you. No, Elias said quickly, shaking his head. You've already stuck your neck out for me enough. If something happens, something will happen, Henry interrupted, his tone firm. And you're not going to face it alone. Look, I get it. You want to do this. But don't be stupid, Elias. If she's tied to the Black Meridian, then you're walking straight into the lion's den. Elias hesitated, his eyes darting to the clock on the workbench. Its relentless ticking seemed louder now, each second a reminder of how little time he had. He looked back at Henry, his resolve hardening. Fine, he said finally, but we need to move fast. If she's there, we might not have long before she disappears again. Henry nodded, slipping the revolver back into his coat. Let's go, but remember, if things go south, we're getting out of there. No heroics, no arguments. Understood? Elias nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Understood. Henry gave him a long look, then moved to the door, checking the locks one last time. Elias followed close behind, clutching his coat tightly as they stepped into the cold night air. The street was quiet, the snow glistening under the faint glow of the street lamps. As they walked toward the truck parked a block away, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Behind them, the shop stood silent and still, its windows dark. But somewhere in the shadows, a figure lingered, their eyes following the two men as they disappeared down the street.